Hello there, and you join me on a beautiful morning as we get straight into this review today of the Canon 90D. I'm just down straight away taking a photograph with the 90D because that's what my reviews are all about. I've got the tide coming in all around me. My leg just got wet, so I'm going to have to be quick, but I am set up for a shot with the Canon 90D on this tripod, and just this fantastic coastal scene here this morning as the tide is coming in. A little bit nervous because I've got to be quick. For this shot, I'm just using some of this beautiful seaweed covered rock here. It's getting the sea washing over it. It's forming a perfect bit of foreground interest. And I then have that quite beautiful sunrise there in the distance with those lovely colours in it, those oranges, those pinks, those yellows, and some blue as well. And it's just going to make a fantastic seascape to start the day. Right, let's talk a little bit about the camera, because this is primarily a landscape photography review, although we are going to go and photograph some birds because I think this is going to be great for wildlife as well. Right, let me just take a knee. Probably going to end up getting quite wet, but whoa. So for this shot, I have a filter on, just a 6-stop filter, just to smooth out a little bit of that water. I'm then at f11, so I can get everything in focus in the foreground and in the distance, and then I'm at ISO 100. I'm bracketing as well because I'm not using any ND grads. I'm just using that 6-stop filter, and that's going to let me get that whole dynamic range in the scene. We might talk a little bit more about the dynamic range of the camera later, but for this case I'm using bracketing, so I'm at a middle exposure of 4 seconds actually, so it's quite a long exposure really, which is going to give us that really smooth water but still have some of the detail as it washes over those rocks. So I've got it on the 2-second timer. I'm bracketing. There we go. It's just going to take a few seconds to do that exposure, and then we'll take a look. That's now done, so I'm finished exposing. Let's just take a quick look at that. I'm probably going to get quite wet down by these rocks and this tide coming in. Let's have a look. Yeah, I mean, that is really nice, really beautiful. I've got that smooth water over those rocks. I haven't managed to zoom into the detail yet. I'll do that when I'm back in a safer spot. But for my first landscape shot with the Canon 90D, I'm very encouraged. That's looking great. This is what it's all about for me. If you're not a regular viewer of my videos, this is what I do. Getting out, doing landscape photography in these fantastic locations because it's just so much fun. It's so beautiful. And it makes you feel great. Yes, it's difficult getting out of bed early for these sunrises, but when you get here, the fresh sea air, the beautiful conditions, it just makes it all worthwhile. Well, we'll talk a bit more about the details of the Canon 90D in a minute, but if you're interested, I'm also testing out the Tokina 11 to 16mm lens. It's brand new, just out, it's an updated model, so it'll be interesting to see how that matches up with the Canon 90D. What a morning, sea all around me. Absolutely brilliant. Right, the sun is up and I've just got off the beach where the tide is now over these very slippy rocks. So I'm back on safe ground, thankfully, but I'm going to take a second shot, and this time I'm going to do it on a vertical and shoot directly into the sun that's just come up above some of the clouds on the horizon. I've got some of the rocks down here in the foreground and they're reflecting that beautiful golden light back at me, so I think it's going to be a nice shot. The reason I want to do this is particularly just to test out the flare control of this Tokina lens, because when you shoot directly into the sun, you're going to usually end up with quite a lot of flare. So we'll see how the lens handles that, and we'll also see how the camera handles that. Not that that's a big part of this equation. So very straightforward shot this time, and I'm at f16. Reason being is I want to shut that aperture down as much as possible, so when you get the sun coming into the camera, it gives you that nice starburst effect. That's the theory anyway. Whether that works out, we shall see. I'm at ISO 100 to keep that noise level nice and low. The noise handling of this camera is actually pretty good for a crop sensor camera. I would suggest it is just as good, if not slightly better, than the Fujifilm X-T3, which I reviewed a little while ago. It's still not on par with some other full frame sensors for noise control, but it's not bad. I took an image of my kids in my darkish living room at about ISO 5000 or something, and it still looked pretty good, especially once you convert it to black and white. 1/60th of a second for this shot, ISO 100, f16, 2-second timer, bracketing again to get all the detail in, and there we go. Let's see how this turns out with that flare control, but still a beautiful scene here at the beach. Yes! So I'm set up for another shot, and let's just talk about dynamic range for a minute to see what the 90D can do with that. Now, I am set up with this beautiful scene just here. I've got these rocks winding their way through the scene, and it's going to be a good test of dynamic range because there's a huge amount of contrast in there, and therefore a big dynamic range is that foamy water is crashing up against those rocks, swirling around and catching some of that beautiful morning light. And that's then contrasted against those beautifully dark rocks with that fantastic shape. And then I've got a very bright sky as well. So it is a good test of dynamic range. I'm going to do it all in one frame. I'm going to go for a long exposure. I've got a 10-stop filter in the camera here on front of the lens. That's going to give me an exposure time of about 15 seconds. Now, a couple of thoughts on dynamic range. Whilst this is a good test, and I am interested, at the same time, I'm not interested about dynamic range. It's talked about a lot, but I don't really think it matters. I've used cameras for years that apparently don't have great dynamic range, and I always manage to get good shots, whether that's at a wedding or landscapes, particularly with landscapes, because you can just bracket the images. So you're getting all that data in the file anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But with dynamic range, until there is a camera that matches what our eyes and our brains see, then I'm really not that bothered. Because if you imagine our eyes and our brains create dynamic range somewhere up here, where we can see pretty much everything in a scene, the camera with the very best dynamic range is somewhere down here at the moment. And then the worst camera is like down here. So really, it just doesn't match up, and until it does match what our eyes and our brains see, I'm not going to be interested. However, I am interested to see what the camera can do regardless of that. So let's take this shot. Now, I already have this 10-stop filter in. It's given me an exposure time of about 15 seconds. I'm at f8 to maximize the sharpness of this lens, and ISO 100 again. So just wait for a nice moment as the sea is crashing around. I think I've got that now. 2-second timer, and then just wait for 15 seconds and we can take a look. Right, that's now done. The sun is very bright in my face now, so I can just see the screen. The screen is quite bright, so it's decent enough. That looks fantastic. Really happy with that. Lovely long exposure shots. Dynamic range looks okay, but I'll find out better when I edit that later. I'll show you that image now. Right, so I've come to my second location of the day to hopefully do some wildlife photography with this camera, because it does have a very fast burst rate. I think it's about 10 or 11 frames per second. It has Canon's sort of second tier autofocus system, so I will get the longer lens on and see if we can get that autofocus system to work to try and capture some birds in flight. But I do want to talk very briefly about the potential elephant in the room with this brand new Canon 90D, and that is the fact that it is a DSLR camera. The DSLR versus mirrorless discussion rages on. I think we need to answer the question, is it still worth buying a DSLR when it feels like everybody and the tide is moving towards mirrorless? Now, I've used many mirrorless cameras now, including the excellent Fujifilm X-T3. I don't personally quite think yet that the DSLR is dead. It does have a number of benefits. Firstly, you have the optical viewfinder, so you're seeing the real world through the mirror system rather than using an EVF. You also get slightly better protection for your sensor when you take the lens off, because the sensor isn't exposed like it is on a mirrorless camera. The weight is often something that people talk about with mirrorless cameras, but I don't actually think this Canon 90D feels any heavier than the Fujifilm X-T3 that I've used before. Certainly if you go up into the medium format cameras from Fuji, which are still mirrorless, they're much heavier than this. So I don't think the weight saving is particularly significant with mirrorless cameras, unless you go to Micro Four Thirds or something like that. One of the other good things about DSLRs is they've been around for a while, particularly if you go with Canon or Nikon. And because of that, you then get access to that huge used market of excellent lenses. Now I'm using a new lens today, but this camera, because it's Canon as well, will fit all of my lenses natively onto the camera without any extra adaptering that I need to buy or anything like that. And like I say, the used market is just awash with great lenses from Canon and Nikon. So if you look to expand your lens range, having a DSLR may give you more options, and there may be cheaper options as well. I don't think it matters really though, DSLR versus mirrorless, does it? I don't know, maybe you think differently, but I'm certainly enjoying this, and I like the fact all my lenses fit onto it. The batteries are the same as well from ones I've already got, so I don't need to buy new batteries. There are some benefits. Right, let's go and find some birds to photograph. This is very often a spectacular place to see the seabirds. Normally you get gannets and stuff on that big rock down there, but it's the wrong time of year, so I'm going to go and find some smaller ones. But I have captured some great scenes from this exact spot before. Great spot. Right, so I found a nice spot where I can test out the autofocus of this Canon 90D. It's a nice little spot looking at some really beautiful little birds. And they're great for this test because they move so fast. So you want that autofocus to match that. Now, it's not the ideal situation because they're on feeders at this nature reserve. Settings-wise, when I'm shooting small birds like this that move really fast, I'm at f5.6, which is the best this lens can do in terms of aperture. I know this lens is excellent for wildlife photography. I've done lots with it before. Focuses really fast, so I know this lens is going to do the job. I'm at 1/1600th of a second, which is going to freeze that action. And then I'm at ISO 2500. Now I'm doing that because I have actually had a few issues with the speed of the autofocus on this Canon 90D. So I'm going to see what I can do with these settings. So I'm just going to loosen off the ball head here and get focused in. I'm in AI servo mode, so it tracks the birds, and I'm using a single focal point. I usually like to use a cluster of focal points, but it just doesn't seem to be working on this camera for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but a single focus point will hopefully do the job. There's a bird on there now, and shoot away. You can hear that rapid fire. You can hear just how quick that is. You're going to fire off a hell of a lot of frames very, very quickly if you keep doing that. Let's have another look. Zoom in, because we want to get that eye in focus. Yeah, I mean, it's not bad. Let's try it for video now. Yeah, and that's doing a really nice job. You can see here, as the birds are landing on the feeder, the autofocus system for video is slightly different. It's the dual pixel autofocus that's so good. You can see it tracking the birds as we go. That's excellent. But I am, like I said, I am just struggling a little bit with the autofocus when you look through the viewfinder. I'm not sure just how fast it is, which puts it into question if this will be a good enough camera for wildlife photography. For birds in flight, I tried it earlier on down by the cliffs and I was struggling. I then put the lens on the Canon 5D Mark IV and I had much better results because that has the better autofocus system. So in terms of a wildlife camera, that autofocus system is just holding it back a little bit, but I'm still getting good shots. So for the cost of the camera, I guess it's not too bad. And there are those other benefits with that video, with that extra reach, with the the frames per second. So it's not a total loss, but not quite as good as I was hoping. But I'm going to persevere and try and get something else. A picture of one of these birds away from that feeder. I'm in my third location of the day, and I want to just talk very briefly about the video features of this Canon 90D, which I am now filming on. I've been using it on a couple of my vlogs recently, and I am really impressed with the video quality. The video features are also pretty good, particularly the fact that this camera provides 4K without any crop. So it becomes actually a 4K that you can really use, as it matches the focal length of the lens that you actually put on the camera, which is a big deal for Canon. Now, Canon receive a lot of grief, shall we say, sometimes, and a lot of it's really unfair because Canon cameras are great, they just work and they've been doing a job for many years. But one criticism I have of Canon is the fact that they seem to hold features back on a lot of their cameras to, I don't know, protect their business, I don't know, but that happens on this camera because they are holding back 24 frames a second for video, along with log as well. And I'd like to see log, so you can do all your color grading in post-production. You get that big dynamic range that log provides. And Canon have held it back. It's not on this camera. Maybe it'll come at a later date, I don't know, but that's very frustrating. But it does have 120 frames a second at 1080p, which is nice for your slow motion video. And overall, I think the quality looks really good. It's got a microphone port and a headphone jack, so you can monitor sound and things like that. And for video, especially with this Tokina 2.8 lens, I just love the video quality and the fact it blows out the background with that shallow depth of field on this lens. Yeah, all-round video features are great. I know a lot of you don't care about that, but if you do, this is a very reasonable camera. Now, the reason I didn't want to use the Canon M6 Mark II, which is almost an identical camera to this, but apart from the fact that it's mirrorless, it's because that also has a flip-up screen, but it sort of flips up from the back to the top. So you won't be able to mount a microphone to the hot shoe, which would be a problem for me. So I wasn't particularly interested in that camera. You've then got all the lens issue that I talked about earlier, having to get new lenses for it or an adapter and that kind of thing. So not particularly fussed about that one. Other alternatives for the Canon 90D are things like the X-T3, which I've mentioned a few times before. Nikon 7500, that's a very similar camera. It's a bit older and therefore a little bit cheaper as well, but we don't get the dual autofocus or dual pixel autofocus that the Canon has, which is always very nice. A lot of people love the Fuji, I love the Fuji, but if I had an option right now between the 90D and the Fuji X-T3, I think I would take the 90D right at this moment in time. But I do want to get down to the beach now to take one more shot as the sun sets, and hopefully some of this high altitude cloud that we have here is going to pick up a lovely bit of pink to finish off the day. Right, so I'm all set for my last shot of the day. The tide is coming in yet again here at the beach. I've got those beautiful pinks now developing in that sky. It's an exciting time of day, and I think this is going to be a fantastic shot to finish off this review. So composition-wise, I'm just using this little channel of water that you can see the tide coming up through now, and it's coming up pretty quick, so I'm going to have to be fast here. It's just washing over my feet now. I'm at f11. I've got a 6-stop filter on the front again to smooth out that motion. I want it to be all about the shape of the rock, the shape of the water, and then that pink sky. So with that, it's at f11. I'm around about 13-second exposure with the current light conditions. ISO 100, 2-second timer. I'm ready to go. I'm auto-focusing just on one of the rocks just down here. It's just been a fantastic experience using this camera today. Perfect for landscape photography. I don't think really you need a full frame sensor for landscape photography. It's got big megapixels, so you can still blow your pictures up nice and big. It's just a really nice camera to use, easy to use. And the lens actually as well, this 11 to 16, I'm noticing very little distortion for a lens this wide. One annoying thing is the autofocus is kind of this pull-push type thing, which is quite frustrating, not that easy to use. And also for the video, although the 2.8 aperture makes it look great, it is very noisy autofocusing. So if you've got the microphone on top of the camera, it picks up a lot of that noise and could potentially spoil your video, right? There's some big waves coming in. I've caught this shot. Let me have a quick look. That's beautiful. I'm so happy with that. There's lots more reviews coming because I've done a deal with B&H Photo, who have sent me this camera to review along with the lens. And it's not sponsored by them. They just send me the gear, I review it. It can be then a completely independent review. I can say whatever I want about the camera, then I just send it back to them and get another one. So check it out on the link down below, which is a link to the B&H Photo website. But yeah, fantastic camera. Loved using it, and very possibly I'm going to pay B&H to keep this one because I like it that much, and I think it will make a perfect vlogging camera, and then also just a walk around camera to do any other kind of photography really, because it's such a good all-rounder. Anyway, I think I need to get out of here now. I'm going to take one more just while I've got a calm moment in the tide. The reflections off this water just look beautiful from that sky. But I'm Adam, this is First Man Photography here on the east coast of the UK at the beach on a perfect evening out.